I'm Colleen Sheehan. I'm director of the Ryan Center for the Study of Free Institutions and the Public Good here at Villanova University. And this is our opening lecture for this academic year. We're here to celebrate Constitution Day. So happy birthday, America. Actually, Constitution Day was a week ago, September 17th. But I was a bit selfish, and I had to be out of town to give a talk in Georgia for their Constitution Day. Georgia has the same Constitution Day as Pennsylvania, actually. So I asked if we could put off ours, keep it within the octave, but put ours off and have it this week, because I very much wanted to hear this lecture. The Ryan Center sponsors lectures, conferences, symposia, reading groups that include students and faculty, undergraduate and graduate students, postdocs, senior visiting scholars, as well as a group of undergraduates called the Ryan Scholars, a group of graduate students called the Ryan Graduate Scholars, and I believe we still have a group of law school students that have their own Ryan Law Scholars group. If anybody's interested in joining us, please sign up outside to be on our mailing list. And if you're interested in being an integral part of what we do, which doesn't mean you have to attend everything, it means that you'll be invited to special things, please let Brenda Hafera know. There's a very short application form, and we'd love to welcome you into our merry band of warriors. Today's lecture, in commemoration of Constitution Day, is sponsored not only by the Ryan Center, but also by the Jack C. Miller Center for Teaching America's Founding Principles and History. It's a group that started a few years ago, and Jack Miller himself, for the work that he's done in promoting the understanding and teaching of America's founding, has recently received a very prominent award for citizenship. So we want to congratulate him on that. Today's lecture is by Professor John-Paul Spiro. It's entitled Shakespeare and America. We are very fortunate to have JP, as we call him, here with us today. He's a great teacher. And if you haven't had him in class, make sure you do before you graduate. He's an incredibly thoughtful scholar, and he has an unmatchable wit, all of which will be on display this afternoon. His research areas, just to set the bar, his research areas are in the fields of philosophy, politics, and literature, particularly the political and theological themes of Shakespeare's plays. JP received his degrees from Vassar, University of Chicago, and CUNY, City University of New York. He's worked in philosophy and literature throughout. He teaches here at Villanova in the ACS program, as well as VCLE, the Villanova Center for Liberal Education. He teaches regularly in the honors program and also works with the Center for Undergraduate Students. And we at the Ryan Center are very fortunate to have him as one of our faculty associates. JP has been incredibly active in working with students in reading groups, for which he is compensated immeasurably, or perhaps unmeasurably. And last year he did a reading group on Machiavelli's Discourses, and this year he is looking at Alan Bloom's Closing of the American Mind, since it's been 25 years since it's been out. So 25 years for Closing of the American Mind, 225 years for the American Constitution. But as Ben Franklin said when the convention closed in Philadelphia on that memorable day of September 17th, 1787, when he walked outside, all the work was done, or at least the work of framing was done. The real work of making a republic had only just begun. A woman asked him, "What do we have, Dr. Franklin? What kind of government did you all make?" And he said, "A republic, if you can keep it." Join me in welcoming JP Spiro.
All right. This is a live microphone, but it would require back strain. So I'll remain around here, and I hope you all can hear me, but I will probably walk about a bit as well. So anyway, I thought it had turned out that I wrote mostly about the Tempest in preparation for this lecture. I didn't want to, but it just made the most sense. And then I thought, well, should I send out some sort of notice in advance telling people to read the Tempest before the lecture? And then I thought, I think pretty much everybody here, students and faculty, are used to going to a lecture where you haven't necessarily read the book. So, so I thought that that wasn't necessary. But anyway, I'll start off with this question. What did Shakespeare think of America? Shakespeare uses the word America exactly once in his entire extant writings, and curiously, it is one of his earliest plays. In The Comedy of Errors, which was actually staged by Villanova's theater department just this past spring, one of the characters, Dromio of Syracuse, describes a beautiful woman to his master, Antipholus, also of Syracuse. He uses an extended geographical, or rather cartographical, metaphor, itemizing her body parts as if they are regions of the world. She is spherical like a globe. I could find countries in her, Dromio says. Antipholus asks which part of her body is Ireland, and then which part is Scotland, which part is France, then England, and then Spain, and then he inquires, where America, the Indies? Dromio replies, "Oh, sir, upon her nose, all o'er embellished with rubies, carbuncles, sapphires, declining their rich aspect to the hot breath of Spain, who sent whole armados of carracks to be ballast at her nose." The exchange ends with Antipholus asking, where stood Belgia, the Netherlands? Dromio answers, "Oh, sir, I did not look so low." The Netherlands joke was a favorite of Shakespeare's. He used it elsewhere. This exchange actually shows us quite a lot. America is identified with the Indies, a place of immense resources and treasures, and a site of conquest by Spain. The Comedy of Errors was written sometime between 1589 and 1594, and it is crucial to remember that for most of Shakespeare's life, America is largely Spanish territory. The Comedy of Errors was in fact written in the wake of the defeat of the Spanish Armada. Now, as I said, this is Shakespeare's only use of the name America, though he makes several other references in his plays to the Indies. In The Merchant of Venice, Shylock refers to Antonio having an argosy bound for the Indies, among many other places, including Libya. Again, this is one region among many, and it's a destination for men seeking treasure. In As You Like It, Rosalind reads aloud from Orlando's terrible poem about her, the first line of which, "From the east to western Ind, no jewel is like Rosalind." This from east to west is actually repeated then in The Merry Wives of Windsor, when Falstaff, hatching a plot, muses aloud, "I will be cheaters to them both, and they shall be exchequers to me. They shall be my East and West Indies, and I will trade to them both." The West Indies are therefore one end of the earth, with the other Indies, what we would now call India, the other end. This distinction between the continent of North America and the islands, sometimes still called the West Indies, that is, the Caribbean, the Bahamas, the Cayman, places where Mitt Romney keeps his money, this had not yet been made. So the British West Indies would not be called such until 1674, almost 60 years after Shakespeare's death. So in these lines, the West Indies are distant, exotic, associated with commerce, and with England's principal enemy, the Catholic Kingdom of Spain. Now, we can find a few other allusions to Ind as the name of a place, another place by Shakespeare, though these probably refer to the east, to India. In All's Well That Ends Well, Helena describes herself as being, "Thus Indian-like, religious in mine error, I adore the sun." While in Love's Labour's Lost, Helena describes herself, oh, sorry, I already did that. While in, Love's Labour's Lost, Barone, again using a Rosaline rhyme, asks, "Who seeks the heavenly Rosaline? That, like a rude and savage man of Ind, as the first opening of the gorgeous east, bows not his vassal head, and struck and blind, kisses the base ground with obedient breast." All of these references, as you might see, are in the comedies, nearly all of which are contemporary in the sense that they take place in what was then the present. The histories and nearly all of the tragedies take place in the past, in worlds where people would have never have heard of America or the Indies. However, it is worth keeping in mind that all of these references to the rude and savage man of India, to men with exotic beliefs and practices, mirrored their associations in Shakespeare's day to the men of the West Indies, and by extension, America. See, for Shakespeare and his audience, America is a foreign country. The English had attempted a settlement in 1584, landing in Roanoke for the purpose of extracting copper and other precious minerals, and also attempting to gain some strategic advantage over the other European nations exploring the New World, mostly Spain, but also the Netherlands. But the endeavor and another attempt 3 years later failed completely. This is never alluded to by Shakespeare, though it is mentioned in a play called Eastward Ho, which was by Shakespeare's contemporaries George Chapman, Ben Jonson, and John Marston in 1605, which is right around the time that Shakespeare is writing and rewriting King Lear. Now, in The Image of America in Montaigne, Spenser, and Shakespeare, scholar William M. Hamlin makes a persuasive case that poor Tom, who is the homeless and insane character created by Edgar in his exile in King Lear, where because he's banished, he ends up basically disguising himself by stripping down to almost nakedness and pretending to be a homeless and insane person. That poor Tom would have had New World associations for some members of Shakespeare's audience. Lear, in his madness, actually sees poor Tom and asks, "Is man no more than this? Consider him well. Here's three on us are sophisticated. Thou art the thing itself. Unaccommodated man is no more but such a bare, poor, forked animal as thou art." Like Duke Sr. and As You Like It, another king in exile encountering the harshness of the natural world, Lear contrasts the falseness and pretense of his courtly world and manner with the literally stripped down real image of man presented by poor Tom. Lear then attempts to remove his own clothes and return to this pre-civilized state. Now, as in As You Like It, the sovereign is mistaken. Just as Duke Sr. is surrounded by flatterers as he's out in the natural world, King Lear is not looking at the thing itself at all, but rather a nobleman whose nakedness and behavior is all a put on, it's a disguise, it's acting. This image of unaccommodated man may be found in stories circulating in London about the same time, about the savages of the New World, from Richard Eden's translation of Spanish explorers to the writings of Thomas Harriot, Richard Hakluyt, Captain Arthur Barlow, John Brereton, Sir Walter Raleigh, not to mention the famous essay by Michel de Montaigne of cannibals. Now, neither Hamlin nor I am suggesting that poor Tom is some kind of Native American. But that the idea of the thing itself, of the natural man, untouched by civilization, whether it be some sort of noble savage or a deranged man on display in Bethlehem Hospital, was an object of speculation and fascination, chiefly through, though hardly exclusively, in Shakespeare's cultural context. It is in the first decade, in fact, of the 17th century that American Indians, as we would call them, are being brought back to England and displayed in public as circus attractions, along with plants and animals and other discoveries, which is actually a practice referred to later in The Tempest. Now, it was John Brereton's account of the New World that inspired Captain John Smith to join the Virginia Company, which departed in late 1606. Shakespeare had a direct personal connection with these settlers. I think this is important. One of the overseers of Shakespeare's will was a man named Thomas Russell of Alderminster, which was about 4 miles from Shakespeare's hometown and permanent residence of Stratford-on-Avon. We have legal proceedings, in fact, we have records of legal proceedings of Russell with a Stratford butcher, so we know he had some ties to the town. Russell was married to a woman named Anne Digges, who was actually born Alice St. Leger, daughter of the famous English soldier and scourge of the Irish people, Sir Warham St. Leger. And her nephew, also named Sir Warham, went with Sir Walter Raleigh to Guyana. Now, that's a thin connection. Anne Digges was also the widow of Thomas Digges, a student of the great scientist and wizard John Dee, who was actually one of the models for Prospero in The Tempest, and was also the greatest mathematician of the age. Now, Anne Digges' son Leonard wrote a dedicatory poem to the first folio of Shakespeare's works, as well as other poems praising Shakespeare. And the dedicatory poem refers to the tomb and monument in Stratford of Shakespeare after his death, and it actually echoes sentiments from his sonnets about how literary works outlive flesh and blood human beings. It's difficult to prove, but when I read the poem, it sounds like it was written by somebody who knew Shakespeare personally. Anne Digges had another son, Sir Dudley Digges, who was actually on the council of the Virginia Company that established the colony of Jamestown in 1607. Now, Shakespeare may have learned the details of the wreck of the ship Sea Venture in Bermuda from Sir Dudley Digges, and it was this shipwreck later recounted in a letter by Sir William Strachey that many think of as the source for The Tempest, but I'll get to all that later. Peter, who was the captain of the Sea Venture? Christopher Newport.
Oh, wow.
Peter's brother teaches at Christopher Newport College, so that's for him. Now, Sir Dudley Digges was also friends with Henry Hudson, and Digges' son Edward was one of the planters who emigrated to Virginia in the 1640s and actually later became governor of Virginia. So Shakespeare has these interesting ties to America, even if he never went there himself. A side thing that I'm actually going to explore further, I'm going to have to look at some archives, is that Sir Dudley's wife was named Lady Mary Kemp, and I think there's a good chance she may have been related to an actor in Shakespeare's company, and she actually lived around the corner from two of Shakespeare's fellow company members in London, like literally around the corner from their house, and they ended up being the editors of the First Folio. So there's further interesting biographical research to be done. Now at this point I actually should talk about The Tempest, the play. Shakespeare's play is most commonly associated with the New World of all the other things he wrote. It's important to note again that scholars have found multiple sources for the play, not just what I mentioned, William Strachey's letter, but also Sylvester Jourdain's discovery of the Bermudas, and other things that detail the details about the Sea Venture shipwreck in Bermuda, as well as a description of the Jamestown colony. Strachey also, who wrote the letter, was a friend of Shakespeare's friend Ben Jonson, and even wrote a poem on behalf of a play by Jonson called Sejanus that Shakespeare acted in. So again, I always keep in mind England is a very small island. There's a very good chance that almost everybody knows almost everybody else. The name Caliban from The Tempest may be a deliberate anagram for the term cannibal, which was the term based on the Spanish name for the Carib people, that is to say the Caribbean people. And so Shakespeare almost certainly had the New World, among other things, in mind as he composed The Tempest, though it is equally important to note that the island in The Tempest is never named. It cannot be Bermuda, because Ariel at one point actually refers to having to go to Bermuda to get something. And it is highly unlikely, actually, that the island could be anywhere near North America. Prospero and Miranda fled the island in a tiny rickety boat, a rotten carcass of a butt, not rigged, nor tackle, sail, nor mast, originating in Naples. And later, Prospero's enemies are shipwrecked on the island in a return trip from Tunis to Naples. So Caliban, the other inhabitant of the island, is the son of a woman originally from Algiers. Everything about the play suggests that the island is somewhere between Italy and North Africa, which is to say a long way from Bermuda or the Indies or America. However, we should keep in mind that throughout his entire career, Shakespeare's geography is basically terrible. It is very likely that Shakespeare never left England, not even to go to Italy, not to go to France. He certainly never came to America. Applying standards of realistic geography to Shakespeare's plays is just willfully obtuse. And yet, even if the island of The Tempest is not geographically associated with America, it is most likely culturally and psychologically associated with the Americas. Now, what does The Tempest tell us about Shakespeare's thoughts and feelings about America? Quite a lot, actually. A lot has been written on the subject, especially in the last few decades. Conversations about The Tempest have become inextricably bound up with arguments about colonialism, about imperialism, mostly beginning with an article by Stephen Greenblatt called Learning to Curse, which was published the year of America's bicentennial, 1976. This continued with many books and articles on many sides through to the angry and contentious occasion of the 500th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's discovery / genocidal conquest of America, however you want to take it, in 1992. And this really does continue on to the present day. I've seen people really lose their tempers talking about this play. It has become impossible to talk or write about The Tempest without picking a side, and often one's position has very little to do with the play itself, and more to do with however you might feel about immigration or American exceptionalism or Ronald Reagan or the 1960s, or the academic trend known as post-colonial studies. I can recall in 1992 George Will writing about there was some professor saying that The Tempest is about the imperialist rape of the Third World, and that Greenblatt replied in print that it was difficult to imagine The Tempest not being at least somewhat about colonialism, though in his words it was also about the magical power of the theater. Now, lest we think these arguments are behind us, I should report to you that The Tempest became recently part of a Mexican studies curriculum in an Arizona school system. And in May of this year, that is May of this year, the Arizona state government cut the program and banned the play for being un-American. So they just kind of conceded the point. Sure, The Tempest is about American colonialism, therefore it makes people hate America, therefore no one should be allowed to read it in school. It reminds me of a 1996 ruling by a New Hampshire school district that banned Twelfth Night because it promoted alternative lifestyles. And there's still a few school boards that will ban Macbeth along with Harry Potter because it has witches in it. Now, much of the historical points I've made about The Tempest draw heavily from Greenblatt and his colleagues, actually, and I hope to show that while the play may not necessarily be about the rape of the Third World, which actually doesn't make any sense, the Third World refers to countries not affiliated with NATO or the Soviet Union, So that tells you something about how useful that category is anymore. It's still a historical stretch to call Bermuda or the Americas prior to the European conquest of the Third World. The play is nonetheless quite clearly about Europeans visiting foreign lands and bringing their baggage, and I mean baggage in all senses of the term, along with them. Indeed, building from my previous points about the New World in Shakespeare's consciousness, just as the feuds in The Tempest are mostly about Italians fighting other Italians, with another battle going on between an Italian and a man of North African descent, the English settlements in Virginia and the Caribbean were much more about fighting the Spanish and competing with other Englishmen than they had to do anything with conquering the natives. In fact, the natives were involved mostly insofar as they could be enlisted to fight on one side or the other, just as Caliban is actually enlisted in the play by Stephano and Trinculo in their plot against Prospero. Again, all you find in New Worlds are versions of what you already know, with new sites for you to continue your battles with your domestic enemies. George Will and Stephen Greenblatt's themselves embody this phenomenon. They project onto the play their own political and cultural assumptions. For example, a common misperception about Caliban is that he is in some way a native or indigenous man, but this is patently false. Everybody on the island in The Tempest comes from someplace else. Caliban's mother, Sycorax, a blue-eyed hag, was an exile from Algiers, Argier in the play, brought to the island by sailors, and then she promptly enslaved Ariel, who is an actual inhabitant of the island. She's not quite a colonist herself, though Sycorax acted upon one in her arrival, and Ariel has to wait for Prospero in order to be set free from Sycorax's cruelty. The only actual natives in The Tempest are the fairies, and Ariel has more in common with Puck and his friends from A Midsummer Night's Dream than with Caliban. Ariel then becomes Prospero's indentured servant. It's clear from the play that Ariel's servitude to Prospero has a time limit on it. And Prospero raised and educated Caliban and only rejected him actually when Caliban attempted to rape Prospero's daughter. Caliban's savagery is thus the savagery of a man who rejected civilization after being presented with it, who cannot control his impulses. His savagery is therefore to a certain extent chosen and natural only in the sense that all men, regardless of their cultural background, are naturally savage. The imaginative but controversial production of The Tempest that was actually performed on Villanova's campus in 2006, which actually set the play in an insane asylum, presented Caliban as a man who had gone native, a man who had chosen to live this way, but was in no way from this sort of background. And I actually think that's a much more textually grounded interpretation than other productions where Caliban is some sort of anti-colonialist freedom fighter or untutored noble savage. Now, as I said about Poor Tom / Edgar and King Lear, we can see Caliban in The Tempest as showing us exactly how it can be impossible to distinguish unaccommodated man from a man who refuses accommodation. Yes, Caliban wonders aloud if Stephano is a god, and then when Stephano gives him wine to drink, he wonders if the wine is a god. But this is a play where also when Ferdinand and Miranda meet, they each think that the other may be a god. Are they speaking conventionally as Renaissance lovers, or are they expressing their true feelings? Are they under Prospero's spell, or acting of their own wills? We cannot tell, and that's the point. Whether or not they are gods is the same problem as whether or not Caliban is a monster. These questions can only be settled by the characters themselves and those who listen to them, that is to say, the audience. The nature and status of humanity in The Tempest is to be decided, not discovered. The island, like many of Shakespeare's second worlds, is a place where, because of its very unfamiliarity, we can ask such questions and bring our answers back home with us. I'm hardly the first person to say this, but the island also helps us figure out not just who we are, but where we came from. Prospero does not really understand his own power and the kind of power required to rule Milan until he is exiled. Europeans don't get much about America, but the existence of America gave them a stronger sense of what Europe meant. However, I will venture some political lessons from The Tempest. The play has been criticized for lacking the action of some of Shakespeare's other plays, and it is small consolation that for many readers, almost every significant action in the play takes place within Prospero's soul. Prospero captures all of his enemies, he foils Caliban's plot. The plot is basically rigged. There's no question whether or not he's going to succeed. But rather than take revenge, he sets everyone free and leaves the island voluntarily, regaining only what was his in the first place. It is not clear if he gives the island to Caliban or if Caliban is coming along with him. I bet on the former, but there's really no textual evidence. It's not clear to me that any great act of forgiveness takes place in The Tempest, but rather an openness to pity, which is not the same thing as forgiveness, and a desire not to go through with the gruesome business of giving everyone what they deserve. Odysseus is a useful contrast here if you think about the end of the Odyssey and his homecoming. and the violence he's all too willing to engage in. Instead, Prospero opts for, and the term must be used, a kind of liberal guilt. It was all my fault in the first place. I brought it all upon myself. I'm in no position to be angry at anyone but myself. One of the most famously difficult lines of the play is when Prospero says, "This thing of darkness I acknowledge mine," which probably applies to Caliban, just as the king of Naples must own his foolish servants who attempted rebellion. Prospero must claim Caliban as his own, take responsibility for that which he should have controlled. He admits his failure with Caliban just as he admitted it with the others. Like Duke Vincentio in Measure for Measure, he brought chaos and disobedience upon himself by being too passive a ruler. He will now be a more active leader, or at least he will concede that a community without active leadership will soon descend into chaos and or be ripe for takeover, either from inside or out. Now, Prospero's mistake, made before the play began, was thinking that his position as Duke of Milan presented him with a special kind of freedom and leisure to pursue wisdom in the liberal arts. In the epilogue of The Tempest, Prospero's famous final lines give us his last wishes. "Now I want spirits to enforce, art to enchant, and my ending is despair, unless I be relieved by prayer, which pierces so that it assaults mercy itself and frees all faults. As you from crimes would pardoned be, let your indulgence set me free." So long as he stands on that stage and lives in this world, Prospero is not free, and none of us are. We have enemies, whether we like it or not, and we show our enemies our power while not retaining not only our capacity to forgive them, but also our desire to do so. In so many of the plays of Shakespeare's later period, that is to say his Jacobean period under King James, the ability to forgive is central to political community. In Shakespeare's tragedies, particularly Coriolanus, the refusal to forgive makes politics impossible, leading to treason, war, and self-destruction. The Macbeths are as much destroyed by their own ability to forgive themselves as by anything else. Meanwhile, in The Winter's Tale, written just before The Tempest, forgiveness is literally a miracle, though in The Tempest, as in Measure for Measure, forgiveness must be the state's tolerance of its inhabitants and the taming of their passions, not the other way around. The people must know that they live at the mercy of those who rule them, and however much they cry for license, they must be ruled. The formerly passive ruler has to assert himself and show them that they are at his mercy. This consolidates the ruler's power and makes the people happy to be included and not excluded or punished. It is worth noting that in both plays, the people's energy should be devoted instead to domestic life, to marriage and producing children, not to advancement or to politics. As Paul Cantor writes, Prospero's wisdom is not just in learning the ways of the political, but to view political life in light of the transitoriness of human achievement in general. Though his original error was to neglect political life entirely, it does not fall into the opposite error of becoming totally absorbed into political life. Now, absorption into any kind of life, mistaking it for the final human end and the totality of human concern, is precisely what Shakespeare challenges in these plays. My own contention is that it is not a coincidence that just as the English and other Europeans are discovering new lands in the first decade of the 17th century, Shakespeare's work is less and less limited by the received and understood universe. For the last 5 years of his writing career, Shakespeare begins to stretch the boundaries of genre and setting. His plays are no longer tragedies, histories, nor comedies, but something else. And though they seem to be set in places we may have heard of, their worlds are not particularly recognizable. In short, The Tempest takes place in a kind of dream world. This dream world is a field for the imagination in which you project yourself, seeing what you want to see while also losing yourself, forgetting who you are and where you came from, leaving you to entertain the possibility that it's not you who are dreaming, but you who are being dreamed. When Prospero tells us about his brother's wicked usurpation of the dukedom of Milan, he, and again with a twinge of regret and compassion, Prospero analyzes his brother's pathology. His brother had taken his dukedom from him, and Prospero says, "He was like one who, having into truth and telling of it, made such a sinner of his memory to credit his own lie, and did believe he was indeed the duke, out of the substitution, and executing the outward face of royalty with all prerogative, hence his ambition growing." That is to say, Prospero's brother convinced himself that he was the duke, and let his imagination and desire take authority over his memory, so much to make his usurpation feel like a restoration. As in so many political disputes, one side says, "You stole that from me," while the other side says, "You stole it and I'm just taking back what's rightfully mine." Now, this is not actually true of Antonio, which is important in the play. Later in the play, when Antonio advises Sebastian to kill his own brother, the king of Naples, Sebastian muses, "I remember you did supplant your brother Prospero." Antonio replies, "True, and look how well my garments sit upon me, much fitter than before." My brother's servants were then my fellows, now they are my men. Sebastian wonders, but for your conscience? To which Antonio asks rhetorically, aye, sir, where lies that? Antonio's line about his clothes suggests that now that he's the Duke, he's more who he is supposed to be, but the whole exchange suggests that titles and status and success go to the men with the will, not the men with the regret. It is psychologically crucial for Prospero that he does not think of Antonio this way, even if it's true. Prospero prefers to think of everything, as I said, as all his own fault. And this is the luxury of being a man with power, to think that the evil behavior of other people is within your control just as much as anything else. You didn't do it. I let you do it. I failed to stop you. Even if this is inaccurate, it's how I choose to see the world. Now, Prospero's megalomania goes where megalomania often goes, totally inwards, towards radical epistemological imbalance. The most famous speech in the play is also one of the most misunderstood, and I will tip my hand here by saying that I think that this speech and the various responses to it, which I will detail, show us much of what we need to know about the place of Shakespeare in the American mind and the places where Shakespeare in the American mind can still go, to the lay of the land and the frontier and the horizon, so to speak. I speak, of course, of Prospero's lines from the end of Act 4. You do look, my son, in a moved sort, as if you were dismayed. Be cheerful, sir. Our revels now are ended. These our actors, as I foretold you, were all spirits, and are melted into air, into thin air. And like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, yea, all which it inherit, shall dissolve, and like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. Now, before I begin, I must note where the speech begins in the play. Prospero has just arranged for the marriage of his daughter Miranda to Ferdinand, the heir apparent to the throne of Naples. Prospero's goal is to regain his dukedom and secure his legacy, guaranteeing a better life and higher position for his descendants. Having arranged the courtship in the first 3 acts of the play, Act 4 of The Tempest is the wedding of Miranda and Ferdinand, and to be honest, it's one of the strangest things that Shakespeare ever wrote. Goddesses and nymphs arrive on the island. The wedding is officiated by Juno herself, the Roman goddess of marriage. Along with Iris and Ceres, there's much talk of fecundity. Erotic love is explicitly banned from the ceremony. Venus and Cupid have been given bad directions, so the wedding will proceed just as Prospero wants it, with no touch of dalliance or the fire and the blood. There's a lot of singing and dancing, and then Prospero interrupts it, recalling, oh right, Caliban and other people are conspiring against me, want to kill me, kill Ferdinand, rape my daughter, etc. Ferdinand and Miranda are upset to see him so angry, and so the first lines of the speech are actually addressed to Ferdinand, telling him not to worry. However, Prospero doesn't comfort Ferdinand really to say, yeah, there's a bunch of guys in the island plotting insurrection, but don't worry about it, I got it. He's actually comforting Ferdinand to say, none of this is real. Now, as the late brilliant Oxford critic A.D. Nuttall construes it, this speech is not about Prospero's fear of Caliban's revenge, but about Prospero's fear that he was never born in the first place, and that his and all existence amounts to nothing. If on the one hand there is worry that all of human life is merely political, that the only things that matter are what kind of society we have, how it is to be maintained, how humanity is to exist in that society, etc., then on the other hand there is another worry, that the alternative to politics is to turn inward, to retreat into one's own private universe where everything exists with reference to me, and confusing events on the other side of the world are just as irrelevant and unknowable and unmanageable as the private desires in the inner life of the person sitting next to you, or like my own private desires and inner life. When Hamlet says that Denmark is a prison and there's nothing good or bad but thinking makes it so, his friend Rosencrantz turns it back in him, telling him that his feelings of imprisonment are really just his own fault. He can liberate himself if only he thinks differently. To which Hamlet responds, "Oh God, I could be bounded in a nutshell and count myself a king of infinite space, were it not that I have bad dreams." Anticipating Freud, Shakespeare writes that there is no such thing as liberation. The world may feel like a prison, we may not like the limits of our options, but there is no freedom within oneself either, not because the mind is not going to behave any more than the guy who lives upstairs and plays his music too loud, or the people on another continent or in a neighboring city rioting in the streets. As per Prospero's request at the very end of The Tempest, only other people can set you free, and only by their actions, not by their ignoring you. One of the most frequently misquoted lines of Shakespeare is, "We are such stuff as dreams are made on." It is on, not of. I thought the origin of this was The Maltese Falcon, the movie where Humphrey Bogart at the very end of the movie actually refers to the object of the title by saying it's the stuff that dreams are made of. But I found it in an 1898 paper by Charles Peirce, the great mathematician, and it's actually the title of a painting by the Victorian fairy world artist John Anster Fitzgerald from, what is it, 1858 or so? Yeah, 1858. So the mistake, though, is telling that people commonly make this error, the stuff that dreams are made of. Because Prospero is not saying that he or we are some kind of fantasy material or inhabitant of a fairy tale world. It's that he and we are the source of dreams, the things that people dream on or about. He is the subject of a dream, not the substance. I may exist, but I also, or perhaps only, exist in the minds of others, for them to imagine and about which they can dream. The as in the statement, we are such stuff as dreams are made of, lightens the load, perhaps, for he does not say we only exist in other people's minds, but that we are as the stuff that dreams are made of, appearing as the likeness of or having the function of appearing in the dreams of others. Prospero may be making a claim about what the contemporary philosopher of mind, John Searle, calls the social nature of reality. As every king in Shakespeare knows or learns, you do not own your image, you just try to manage it. And you must understand that your power is based on how and what people think of you, what image you cast in their minds. If Shakespeare learned anything from Machiavelli, I think it was that. And if there was anything, it should be said that came really naturally to Elizabeth I and not at all naturally to James I. It was that. Now this speech commanded my attention for another reason. In a conversation with my colleague Andrew Beauvais, he alerted me to an allusion to Shakespeare made by George Washington in one of his letters. And this brings me to the Shakespeare and American culture segment of my lecture. In a letter dated October 3rd, 1778, addressed to Henry Lawrence of South Carolina, the fifth president of the Second Continental Congress, General George Washington ruminated about the British Army's poor tactical decisions. I am well convinced myself, he wrote, that the enemy, long ere this, are perfectly well satisfied that the possession of our towns, while we have an army in the field, will avail them little. It involves us in difficulty, but it does not by any means ensure them conquest. They well know that it is our arms, not defenseless towns, which they have to subdue before they can arrive at the haven of their wishes, and that till this end is accomplished, the superstructure they have been endeavoring to raise, like the baseless fabric of a vision, falls to nothing. So what this means is that the Redcoats know that so long as the Continental Army exists, they can't win. Taking and holding towns doesn't help their position in any real way, and in worse, it in fact strains their resources and works to Washington's advantage. The British have a plan, but so long as there is another team in the field, the plan is just that, and not likely to come to fruition. 12 years later, Gouverneur Morris used the phrase baseless fabric of a vision in a letter to Washington, dated November 22nd, 1790, referring to the Prussian monarchy. Again, in this usage, the phrase means plans that fail to materialize. The quotation turns up again during Washington's presidency. In May 1795, a gathering of Americans with French sympathies assembled in Philadelphia to celebrate recent French military victories. The assembled men gave a series of toasts, first to France and then to Holland, whom the French had just defeated. Then the men saluted the Republic of America. May the sentiment that impelled her to resist a British tyrant's will and the energy which rendered it effectual prompt her to rebel usurpation in whatever shape it may assail her. And then I imagine everybody said, huzzah, or something like that. The next toast, the Republic of America, may the aristocracy of wealth founded upon the virtues, the toils, and the blood, her revolutionary armies soon vanish, and like the baseless fabric of a vision, leave not a wreck behind. Huzzah, right. Now, I couldn't find a list of the men present, and the only source I have so far for this is John Marshall's massive 5-volume biography of George Washington. Marshall was, of course, Washington's close friend and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, stuff like that. But whoever gave these toasts to America was very concerned about the state of the American Republic and worried that it was already losing its revolutionary spirit, that the already emerging aristocracy and other domestic energies were ready to seize power, but hoping that they would vanish like the nymphs and fairies at the wedding of Miranda and Ferdinand. Washington was invited to this gathering, by the way, but he did not attend. Major General James Mitchell Varnum, the commander of the Rhode Island militia, later a member of Congress and a member of Washington Society of the Cincinnati, wrote to Washington, "Such is the dreadful situation in this country that it is the power of any state to frustrate the attention of all the others. This calamity is founded in the Articles of Confederation and will continually increase till that baseless fabric shall yield some kind of government which can tame the passions of the people." Washington replied that he was equally concerned but could not view the people so pessimistically. This usage of baseless fabric actually stands out as it refers that something that does exist. He was writing about the Articles of Confederation, but in his eyes they had no sound foundation. The problem was because of all the veto points that you couldn't pass legislation, which is fortunately a problem we have since solved. In most of the other contemporary uses of baseless fabric, in longer and shorter versions, it's used with reference to a fantasy-reality distinction. For example, at the Constitutional Convention, Hugh Williamson, who was representing North Carolina but was actually from Chester County, Pennsylvania, continued, "I do not hazard much in saying that the present Constitution had never been adopted without these preliminary guards on the Constitution. Establish the general doctrine of bounties, and all the provisions I have mentioned become useless. They vanish into air, and like the baseless fabric of a vision, leave not a trace behind." Yes, he gets a word wrong at the end, but he's not the only one. None other than Thomas Jefferson, in a 1770 letter to his friend John Page, writing about learning that his birthplace had burned down, wrote, "Having, as was my custom, thrown my thoughts into the form of notes, I troubled my head no more with them. These are gone, and like the baseless fabric of a vision, leave not a trace behind." He put the line in quotes in the letter, so he knew where it came from, even if he remembered it wrong. My own research have found that the edition of Shakespeare that Jefferson had was the Hamner edition. Thomas Hamner was a former Speaker of the English House of Commons, and his edition is like the worst one that was ever created. It's really cumbersome. It's filled with errors. It was one of the things that you bought to be furniture for your rich man's library. It's not a book that you purchased in order to read. Now, unsurprisingly, one can find a more correct version of this quote from The Tempest, and then some, in the writings of John Adams. In the Discourses on Davila, Adams argues, "A deathbed, it is said, shows the emptiness of titles." That may be, but does it not equally show the futility of riches, power, liberty, and all earthly things? The cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself appear the baseless fabric of a vision, and life itself a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Shall it be inferred from this that fame, liberty, property, and life shall always be despised and neglected? Shall laws and government which regulate sublunary things be neglected because they appear baubles at the hour of death? So Adams begins that with a paraphrase of a sentiment from the beginning of The Tempest, which is that the violent waves of the storm do not care for the name of king, just as the harsh winds in the forest of Arden or on Lear's Heath do not discriminate between rich and poor, titled and common. But Adams then incorporates quotes from Macbeth, wanting to make sure that a disregard for the honorifics of nobility, fed by the sentiment that we all die and take nothing with us, would not descend into abject nihilism. Just because everything fades and dies doesn't mean that titles have no use or purpose, whether the title in question be king or duke or vice president. And here we might recall the famous historical blunder of John Adams when he advocated for special titles for the President of the United States, such as His Majesty the President, His Mighty Benign Highness, or His High Mightiness. Now, the phrase baseless fabric of a vision can also be found in a digression in Paper Money and observations on the nature of civil liberty, the principles of government, and the justice of the policy of the war with America, published in 1776 by Welsh dissenter Richard Price. Price was friendly with Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Thomas Paine, and in fact, Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France was written partly in response to a sermon by Price. One can also locate the quotation in the writings of Malthus, Bentham, Thomas Reed, and more than once in the works of a student of Price's, Mary Wollstonecraft. Baseless fabric of revision is in fact deployed plenty more in 19th century English and American writings, such as in the writings of Charles Spurgeon, an American Baptist preacher, in a gloss of 1 Peter, saying, "May your faith be no baseless fabric of a vision." It turns up in several letters to the editor in newspapers all over America, all over the 19th century, really. The Prospero baseless fabric speech seems to have been used like a version of Percy Shelley's poem Ozymandias or Coleridge's Kubla Khan. It's about how great achievements disappear. It was generally anti-idealist, about how something imagined is not real, about how the best laid plans of mice and men oft go astray. That's not actually from Shakespeare. Whereas Shakespeare's play, The Tempest, as I read it, is not about plans failing to be realized or being exposed as fantasies. All the plans in the play on Prospero's side come to fruition unless he chooses otherwise. But instead, The Tempest is much more about how the procession of human life turns out to be a spectacle, a procession, a parade, a ceremony, just as King Henry V wonders aloud before the Battle of Agincourt about idle ceremony and asks, "Art thou aught else but place, degree, and form, creating awe and fear in other men?" It leaves no trace, as in a theater after the scenery has been removed, or a political convention after they've swept up all the balloons and confetti. Our little life is rounded by a sleep, our own sleep, when we die, but others who will sleep on us. Remember us, if only vaguely and in a distorted way. I think Adams is right that this is not an attack on idealism so much as a statement about the fleetingness of all human life, not just a tale told by an idiot signifying nothing, but as a source for other people's dreams, who will themselves become sources for other people's dreams, and so on. Theater is actually crucially different from film in this respect, and since once a play is performed, it's gone, you can't get it back. A recording of a play is in no way the same thing as a play. It only lives in your memory, which, as we know, decays and distorts. Shakespeare's use of rounded in this speech is also, I think, wonderful. It's brought to an end or to completion, yes, but also possibly brought to full form. Shakespeare used the verb round sometimes even to mean pregnant, as in The Winter's Tale, the queen your mother rounds apace. Our little life may end, but it also reproduces itself, both with sleep. The key distinction here is that for the 18th and 19th century audience, this line was used to describe the emptiness of unfulfilled human intention. Think again back to General Varnum's rage about the undue restraints he suffered under the Articles of Confederation. Almost always this is directed at a foe who thought he had a great idea, but it turned out to be nothing. In Shakespeare, it's a line about everybody, about the inability to distinguish reality from fantasy in the first place, about the blurry lines between sleep and waking, life and death, conclusion and perpetuation. Now, as some of you may noticed, baseless fabric of a vision leave not a wreck behind is a misquotation. It should be baseless fabric of this vision. And then there are 4 more lines culminating in, like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a wreck behind. Why did so many people get this wrong? It reminds me of just like a lot of people think there's a line in Casablanca called Play It Again, Sam, where actually nobody ever says that in Casablanca. It's another movie altogether, but people tend to elide the two. Why is this? In 1667, again, decades after Shakespeare's death, then prominent English poets William Davenant, who actually claimed to be Shakespeare's illegitimate child, but that's a separate story, and John Dryden revised The Tempest into a play called The Enchanted Island, drastically shortening it and also coarsening it, adding a saucy sister character to Miranda named Dorinda. The Tempest actually stands out among Shakespeare's works as one of his least dirty, so Dryden and Davenant had to dirty it up in order to make it acceptable, particularly to a Restoration audience. The play was then further revised by the poet-playwright Thomas Shadwell, and this became the standard performance version in England, lodging itself in the public consciousness. In 1709, Nicholas Rowe published the first major edition of Shakespeare's works after the First Folio, and in the introduction to that work, one can find the baseless fabric of a vision, leave not a wreck behind misquotation, even though the correct version of the play is the one used in the edition itself. Right. Now, the play was revised again by the great actor John Philip Kemble, who drew freely from Shakespeare's original while incorporating elements of the various revisions. And it is in this version that Prospero's speech doesn't come at the end of Act 4 after the wedding, but at the very end of the play. These are the last spoken lines of the play, thus making them the most memorable. And they're spoken not to Ferdinand, but to the audience, telling them not to worry because the play is not real. Shakespeare's original unrevised Tempest, by the way, was not performed in England until 1838 and not in America until 1854. Now, the frequency of this misquotation shows us how much Shakespeare was a theatrical experience for English and Americans in the 17th, 18th, and much of the 19th century. They got his works in the playhouse, not at their desks or around the family hearth. Indeed, George Washington was an ardent theater goer, and we know that he saw The Tempest at least once during his presidency. It's in his diary. He had seen his first play in Barbados in 1751, and his diaries after that feature many entries about going to see plays, often with the tag, treating ladies. Washington also donated to theater companies, and during the Revolution, he arranged for theatrical performances for his troops while they were camped at Valley Forge, even though theater was otherwise forbidden during the American Revolution. One of Washington's first acts when he became president was to reauthorize the theater. And 10 days after his inauguration, he went to a play at the John Street Playhouse in New York. He even had a private performance of Julius Caesar at the presidential mansion. That's interesting, Julius Caesar, with his teenage step-grandson playing Cassius. John and Abigail Adams were frequent guests of Washington's presidential box at theaters in New York and Philadelphia. During his vice presidency, in fact, Adams once referred to the U.S. Senate as a collection of characters like one finds in the works of Shakespeare, and he did not mean that as a compliment. It meant mostly that it was like a collection of good and bad men. Prior to that, during his diplomatic years in Europe, Adams and Jefferson visited Shakespeare's house in Stratford and even chipped off pieces of Shakespeare's writing chair, or what they call Shakespeare's writing chair at that tourist attraction. Tellingly, Adams wrote about this later in letters, whereas Jefferson only wrote about the gardens and foliage that he saw on the trip. Now, you may think that surely some Americans had a love for Shakespeare prior to the mid-18th century. You might be right, but we have scant evidence, and we have considerable evidence to the contrary. The first Americans and their progeny were not disposed to enjoy Shakespeare, or really much of any Shakespeare. So if you don't like Shakespeare, you have a long American tradition behind you. Indeed, the first theaters that opened in North America were in Mexico City and in Canada, before they could be opened in American colonies. Remember, I said Washington went to his first play in Barbados. There weren't any theaters in the US for him to go to, or in America for him to go to, the colonies. Now, the reason for this is very simple. Puritans hate Shakespeare, just as they hate all theater. They tried to shut down the theaters during Shakespeare's own time, and he and his colleagues lampooned them mercilessly in their plays. The Puritan-led takeover of the English government in 1642 to 1660 is the only time when Shakespeare's plays were not performed regularly in England. It's the only 16-year window, and it was during the Revolution led by the Puritans. And it's precisely those kinds of people who had been landing in Massachusetts. Increase Mather and, in fact, other preachers opposed the opening of theaters in Boston, and Shakespeare would not be performed in Massachusetts or Rhode Island until the late 1760s, and even in that case, the plays were presented as what were called moral dialogues. So you would have like Cassio's drunk scene from Othello, and then this would be a lesson about why drinking is bad. Meanwhile, in Pennsylvania, William Penn and most Quakers particularly disliked Shakespeare and wanted no theater in their great commonwealth, fearing the propagation of the infamous plays of those comical wits, Sylvester, Shakespeare, Johnson, etc., wherein the preciseness and singularity of Puritans and others are abusively represented for the entertainment of vain and irreligious persons. That's Penn in a letter. In 1682, Pennsylvania laws lumped theater in with gambling and cockfights, all of which would be liable to punishment. The first theater to open in Pennsylvania was in 1723 in Philadelphia, but it was opposed by the mayor, who was actually not some fool. It was James Logan, who was Penn's secretary, but also a brilliant scientist. He shut it down, and another theater did not appear in Philadelphia until the 1760s. Logan, however, was a reader of Shakespeare, which shows that hatred of Shakespeare was more popular than an elite phenomenon at the time. Also, that very same year, 1723, that the theater opened in Philadelphia, the Harvard Library bought an edition of Shakespeare's First Folio, even if it wasn't on the curriculum. Now, I'm speaking of theater generally here, not of Shakespeare. The first performance of a Shakespeare play in the United States was a 1730 production of Romeo and Juliet in New York City. It was an amateur effort with an actual doctor advertised himself as the apothecary. This seems to be a source for the subplot in Shakespeare in Love. There is no other record of a Shakespeare play being performed in the colonies until 1750, when an English touring company brought Richard III to New York and to Virginia. Otherwise, there is very little, and again, most of these are adaptations bearing little resemblance to the originals. However, starting in the late 1760s through the 1770s and on, Shakespeare was brought to the American people much the same way it was brought to the English people, by famous stage actors with an entrepreneurial spirit. As David Garrick became one of the most famous and respected men in London, dazzling people with his performances in Shakespeare's really big parts, and he would edit the plays so that the big parts were even bigger. The English actor Lewis Hallam, knowing that he could not rival Garrick, moved with his theater company to America in the 1750s, where they performed The Merchant of Venice. They then moved to Jamaica for a while because the audiences were bigger there, but they came back a decade later and started what they called the American Company. The Hallams became the greatest theatrical performers and impresarios of the age, building the first theater in Philadelphia, the Southwark, which I found it was on South and 4th Streets, which is currently the location of Jim's Steaks. Shortly thereafter, Shakespeare became more popular in the United States than in England, if you think about the percentage of the market share that he had, the percentage of plays produced, which seems to be roughly Shakespeare's always 20 to 25% of all plays produced in America at any given time. Although I just saw a list of the 10 most popular playwrights in America in terms of productions per year, and they didn't even include Shakespeare, and they had a footnote. It's like, it's not fair. And if you added all of the 10 playwrights, it wasn't still all of the productions of Shakespeare in America, and that's pretty much every year for the past several decades. Shortly thereafter, Shakespeare actually became more popular in the United States than in England, as American audiences prefer 16th century English plays to 18th century English plays. There are at this time no American plays to stage, so they're resisting what's then the contemporary English theater and celebrating the earlier English theater. This is interrupted, however, by the Revolution. The Continental Congress banned theater in 1774, and notably when the British occupied American cities, such as New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, there was more theater in those cities under the British than there had been under the Americans. The British in Boston even mocked the Puritans, comparing them to Cromwell's people. After the war, starting around 1790, Shakespeare becomes a popular bestseller in the United States, though all editions are essentially pirated or plagiarized based on earlier English editions. Starting in 1795, the first edition of Shakespeare's works are printed in the United States, that is to say not imported, though Shakespeare is not yet a source for academic study and would not be until the 1840s, 50 years later. This comes to a head in 1849. I was amazed at the story, the year of the Shakespeare riots, which is to say there was a popular American actor named Edwin Forrest. There's a theater name for him in Philadelphia, actually. He was like a big, beefy, masculine, like a Gerard Butler kind of actor. And he had toured England and gotten terrible notices. They all said he was terrible. Who's this American think he is performing Shakespeare? Meanwhile, his English rival, William Charles Macready, was the most popular English Shakespearean of the age. He toured America several times. Everybody loved him. Everyone went to see him. So Forrest basically staged a protest in New York City, and he got a bunch of working men to gather together and sort of challenge, how dare this Englishman come and perform Shakespeare when we have our own American Shakespeareans. And this led to a Macbeth-off, where they both did Macbeth on the same night in theaters very near each other, Astor Place on the Bowery in New York, on the same night. There was actually a third performance of Macbeth that night, but nobody cares. But just imagine having 3 different Macbeths to go to on any given night. This feud sold a lot of tickets. People shouted and threw things at Macready's performance. It led to the curtain falling during Act 1. This embarrassed everybody, and prominent New Yorkers like Herman Melville and Washington Irving are apologizing to Macready and saying, you know, please perform Macbeth again. This time the ruffians organized, passing around a flyer that read, "Working men's shall Americans or English rule this city. The crew of an English steamer have threatened all Americans who dare express their opinion this night at the English aristocratic opera house. We advocate no violence, but a free expression of opinion to all public men. Working men, free men, stand by your lawful rights." Signed, the American Committee. Notice that the content is ignored. It's all just about free speech, right? And what's amazing about this is that they're arguing not about whether or not Shakespeare should be performed, but about who gets to perform him and really who owns him. The National Guard was called with policemen at the ready. This is actually the first time in American history that a militia was called out against the American people. And during Macready's performance, a crowd actually assembled and rioted. Troops came, people wouldn't leave. They said, "I dare you to shoot us." They started shooting. 30 people, 30 rioters were killed, 50 were wounded, 50 to 70 policemen were injured, 140 militiamen were injured. This is over a performance of Macbeth. Okay. There's a whole lot I could say about this. I highly recommend Nigel Cliff's book, The Shakespeare Riots. But my point of emphasis is that we already see Americans competing with Englishmen, not about Shakespeare, but about who can do it better. This contest continues, I found in a lot of reviews of Americans performing Shakespeare in the 1880s through the 20th century, where they kept saying, it's so lucky this American is liberated, he doesn't have to do a traditional reading, he doesn't have to do a conventional reading, he's freed from the bounds of constraints of being an English Shakespearean actor. And it's also remarkable that these working class men did not see Shakespeare as some sort of unavailable, hoity-toity high culture, but something of their own. Now, since Shakespeare is an unquestionably English playwright and poet, and America fought a war declaring its independence from England, how and why could Shakespeare become so popular in the United States of America? In short, we can say that in order for Shakespeare to become not only possible but even permissible, Americans had to massage, if not relieve or resolve, certain domestic tensions and cultural anxieties about public morality, about education, democratic values, and American identity vis-a-vis Englishness. These conflicts begin to be resolved by the end of the Revolutionary War and the founding of the American Republic, but they really do play out over the subsequent 200+ years. You can even see this if we go back to the Founding Fathers. Basically, for Washington, Shakespeare was entertainment. He was a source of words and phrases, of images. Meanwhile, for Adams, who was a real reader of Shakespeare, and I specified a lot of people saw Shakespeare in the theater, but everything about Adams in his diary suggests that he was reading Shakespeare constantly. And it appears to be Adams who's the first to clarify the attraction this way. Let me search for the clue which led great Shakespeare into the labyrinths of human nature. Let me examine how men think. Right? That's the spirit in which he approached Shakespeare. Adams may, in fact, I think, have been one of the first Americans to really idolize Shakespeare, treat him as one of the greatest poets and thinkers of world history with singular perception into the human soul. Jefferson read Shakespeare as a source of moral tales. He even wrote to a friend, "You can find a lively and lasting sense of filial duty more effectively impressed on the mind by reading King Lear than all the dry volumes of ethics and divinity that were ever written," which actually makes me think that Jefferson never read King Lear. But in a sense, Jefferson was the flip side of the New England Puritans, reading Shakespeare in a purely moral sense, about conduct, about not for insight into human nature. Jefferson then, of course, came to the opposite conclusion about morality when reading Shakespeare than the Puritans. But a lingering question, returning to our Tempest discussion, is not whether or not Shakespeare is moral or immoral or colonialist or whatever, but whether or not it matters and why we read any literature in the first place. It may come as a surprise to the people gathered in this room that Shakespeare was not always read in school, in England or in America. English literature was not a subject appropriate for higher education until the 1880s. Universities have been around since the 1100s. Right? This is very recent that Shakespeare and English literature in general actually gets onto the curriculum. I know you're all thinking, wow, I could go to college and not read Shakespeare, but great, you can all translate Cicero instead. I would actually prefer that. Prior to that, students would focus on classics, religion, law, and the sciences. One might encounter passages from English literature, including Shakespeare, in courses on elocution, grammar, and rhetoric, but discussion of the themes and ideas of Shakespeare was expected to be something students did on their own time as part of their self-education. In the 50 years between 1790 and 1840, we can see that the Americans did just that. In Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, which was written in the first half of the 1830s, Tocqueville mentions that some volume of Shakespeare can be found in any pioneer hut, and he admits that it's actually in somebody's house that he first read Henry V. We have records of amateur performances of Shakespeare on the American frontier with improvised costumes, people wearing boots and spurs and doing Julius Caesar, or wearing their Revolutionary War uniforms to do Richard III. I would have loved to have seen any of those. One also finds excerpts from Shakespeare in textbooks for secondary education, though in such books the editors admitted to much change and remodeling for the special purpose to influence the heart by sound moral and religious instruction, which say you can use Shakespeare to teach morality and religion, you just have to change the words when you do it. For example, the trial scene in The Merchant of Venice is included in books like this, but the most anti-Semitic and the most anti-Christian passages are cut out, and Portia is a man. This period also sees the formation of Shakespeare clubs in cities and communities. So all throughout the 19th century, people are doing this on their own, forming Shakespeare clubs. Women's Shakespeare groups go well back into the late 18th century. In fact, the first work of scholarship on Shakespeare by an American is by a woman in 1753, so when nobody was performing it. This is Charlotte Lennox's book, Shakespeare Illustrated, which is still used by scholars as an analysis of Shakespeare's sources. There's also a lot of books written specifically for women and children using Shakespeare, which are quite fascinating to read now. And this is in the 19th century, like Desdemona is a model wife, or Kate figured something out at the end of Taming of the Shrew. Right? This tradition carries on, I think, in high schools that refuse to teach the bawdier plays and insist on moralizing interpretations of the tragedies. Now, in most of the 19th century, colleges only offered 1 or 2 courses in English. And that's not that they only require 1 or 2, like here, then they only offer 1 or 2 courses in what we would call English. And this would be a philology class where you would learn strict grammar and you'd be taught by a German or somebody who trained at a German university. This I also just found out. The first Greek classes offered in Greece were taught by Germans. I think it's wonderful. In the Education of Henry Adams, actually, Adams talks about how everything's German at Harvard now. Nobody reads Shakespeare or anything like that. Shakespeare first gets into the curriculum in the United States at the science schools, which could not offer Latin and Greek. They didn't have the staff, but they needed some kind of humanities-ish course. And here and there, Shakespeare courses get into American colleges, becoming part of the curriculum around the 1790s. The first Shakespeare courses taught in the United States are taught at the University of Virginia, where, ironically for Jefferson, almost the entire faculty in the 19th century were from England. Now, how did Shakespeare become not just part of the American entertainment mainstream, but essential for every educated American? The problem remained that Shakespeare was not only English, while America did not yet have its own literature, but that Shakespeare was obviously a monarchist and an apologist for aristocratic values with detectable suspicions about democracy. In fact, in 1838, Orestes Brownson grumbled, "We are now the literary vassals of England and continue to do homage to the mother country. Our literature is tame and servile, wanting in freshness, freedom, and originality. We write as Englishmen, not as Americans. Shakespeare and Milton might be good, but English literature cramps our national genius," he wrote, and saying that Shakespeare wrote the text of modern life, the text of manners. He drew the man of England and Europe, the father of the man in America. He drew the man and described the day and what is done in it. He read the hearts of men and women, their probity and their second thought and wiles, the wiles of innocence, and the transitions by which virtues and vices slide into their contraries. So Emerson, like Adams, reads Shakespeare as the book of human nature, not just good for Americans, but uniquely available to Americans. I'm realizing that I'm almost at the end, but I'm running a bit late on time. I wanted to skip then to the last bit, and I felt terrible. I wrote this, and I realized that there was something really important I needed to talk about with reference to Shakespeare and America, and then I just didn't have a lot of time, but I think it plays itself out in a lot of the terms with which I've given, which is on April 10th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was riding in a steamship from Richmond back to Washington in the closing years, the closing days of the Civil War, and he entertained his friends by reading aloud his favorite passages from Shakespeare. This was his very favorite passage from Shakespeare, which was Claudius's "Oh, my offense is rank" speech from Hamlet, which is the speech where Claudius realizes everything that he's done and admits it aloud, but then has no idea what to do with himself now that he realizes that my whole life, everything as it exists right now, is because I've done horribly evil things and I can't undo them. But otherwise, Lincoln read mostly aloud from Macbeth, particularly all of the speeches about conscience that Macbeth gives in and around the place of the regicide. And so a lot of scholars have commented on this, that 5 days before Lincoln's assassination, he was reading aloud all of these passages that were about killing a sovereign. Right? My own reading of that is that Lincoln was reading aloud passages, his favorite passages from Shakespeare, that are all about a man who is having a very difficult time living with the consequences of his choices and what he has done. Right? Whether they were right or wrong isn't really the issue, because you can never really know the answers to those sorts of questions, at least not with your own mind. It's much more just dealing with the consequences. What have I done? What have I wrought? What have I done to the universe? This is all the more interesting because Lincoln was killed, as you may know, by one of the most famous Shakespearean actors of the age. John Wilkes Booth was not some nobody. He was considered the handsomest actor in America. He was the Romeo of the age. Everybody would come out to see him play Romeo. He had recently appeared in Julius Caesar with his brothers, they were the most prominent theatrical family of the middle of the 19th century. And it was drawing inspiration from Julius Caesar that led Booth to shoot Lincoln. Right? What interests me is that both of these men are quintessentially American. Not one or the other, but both of them. Right? And that Lincoln, like some people I've already talked about, reads Shakespeare purely morally. Shakespeare is the poet of the individual conscience. Right? Booth reads Shakespeare politically. Shakespeare's the guy who teaches us that tyranny is bad and that you have to do something about it. Right? The more I think about this, the one I'm not sure which one is the better reader of Shakespeare. Right? Though I would hate to have to choose one over the other. Right? But another thing I think about this, and now I lost the thought entirely, is that in these two quintessential strains of the American character, we can see it by their different responses to Shakespeare, just like we saw it in the riots. Right? Shakespeare, interestingly, began as, in America, is it English? Do we like it? Do we not like it? What do we do about it? Shakespeare became not some guy who's playing on the other team to being a guy who's playing on my team, but then he turned into kind of the ball, this thing that we fight about. But then Shakespeare became the field, or better maybe the court, the thing that we fight on. And so long as we use Shakespeare in order to have our battles, as opposed to simply having battles about him, or about limiting what he means, I think that we as Americans, and perhaps uniquely among other countries, we as Americans are in a good position so long as we have all of these works. The final image I thought of with reference to Shakespeare in America is that since we do this, we continually fight about him, we teach him, we think about him in new ways, we talk about him in new ways, we produce new movies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We don't know if Shakespeare is an infinitely renewable resource, but we'll treat him like one until we find the bottom of the well. I think that's a pretty American way of going about things. And in this case, I don't really mind. So, thank you.